Do you want your poems to emotionally resonate with your readers? Well, you're in the right place. Poetry's purpose is to reach other people and touch their hearts. Whether you're a beginner or not, this video gives you 12 steps to write poems that will emotionally resonate with your readers. These steps are based on Ted Kooser's much loved poetry craft book, The Poetry Home Repair Manual. So if you want to improve your poetry writing skills, sit back and watch these 12 steps until the end. Oh, and stay tuned for the bonus. Your creative impulse will thank you. Step 1, learn from others and teach yourself. Most of a poet's education is self-education. You will learn how to write poems mostly by writing poems and by reading poems. It is up to you to take this on yourself. But you can also learn aspects of constructing poems, which is what this video is for, and also what Ted Kooser's book is for. Step 2, you are not only writing for yourself. As we stated at the beginning of this video, if your poem is to touch a reader's heart, it needs to extend out to them in order to do that. If it's all about you and looking within, there's no reaching out. There's no ability for it to do that. One way to ensure that you touch a reader's heart is to remember that poetry is communication. You are bringing something out to someone. You are having a dialogue with them. Elsewhere, I've said that poetry is the opposite of small talk, and the opposite of small talk tends to get somewhere deep and it connects the two people that are engaging in the dialogue. Therefore, you want to ensure your readers are most likely going to go deep into their own resonant feelings when they're hearing your poem. If it's all focused on something melodramatic that you're experiencing, your reader is not likely going to feel invited into it. So a poem with too much self-sentiment and navel gazing is going to be similar to this experience. You might be wanting to say like, I want to say all these feelings and bring them up and throw them out, but if the reader doesn't feel like they're invited into the poem, then they're less likely going to feel a resonance with it. Kooser says that any well-made poem is worth a whole lot more to the world than to the person who wrote it. If you have any ambition as a poet, you need to make sure that your poems resonate. Here's the advice. When writing, picture an imaginary reader. It can be anyone. It can be an academic, a store clerk, a tech bro, your mum. Picture that you're writing this poem for someone. Then you get to think about how they might respond to it. Step 3, watch out for ego. All of us have egos, and egos aren't necessarily a bad thing. They are what keep us alive. But to be egotistical with your poems is another thing altogether. Good poetry requires a depth in your poems. You don't need to walk, talk, and act like a poet. There's no such thing. The only thing that you need to do to be a poet or to aspire as a poet is to write poetry. Ted Kooser has a quite funny example in his book saying that when he was at college, he was beret wearing, what's the fucking coat called? But turtleneck. He was wearing a black turtleneck and a beret with a book of Kierkegaard's philosophy tucked under his arm to make his bicep look bigger.
How do you say beret?
Beret. I don't know, maybe I said it wrong.
Berry.
Maybe it's beret. We'll just put a picture of it, everyone will know what I mean. He said that he was only wanting to look like a poet so that people thought he was sexy. But he realized that in order to be a poet, he, I quote, had to write at least one poem. What he admits is tragic and comic. It makes me think about pretending that you've gone to the gym by wearing sports clothes and throwing water over your face. It looked like you did a hard workout without actually having done any of the workout. And besides, the poetry writing process is not exactly attractive. It's frustrating, it's hard work, it makes you tussle with ideas as you're trying to say exactly what you want to say. But there's a payoff. The payoff is that exhilaration you get for saying something as strongly as possible, and then the second payoff is that you share it with someone. So by all means, be sexy. Just know that poetry doesn't necessarily require that. It requires some other things altogether.
Be sexy - Nathan Hassall.
Be sexy. Step 4, be specific. It is important to be specific in your poems rather than general, because in specificity is where the universal paradoxically lies. As Kooser says, meaning in poetry arrives almost unbidden from an accumulation of specific details. To be specific requires that you cultivate a sense of attention. Attention? To be specific often requires that you cultivate attention strongly. For example, if you go to the beach, most people are looking at the ocean. You probably are looking at it as well, but the ocean is vast and non-specific. A poet's attention should be alert to more specifics on the beach. For example, when the wave crashes, it creates clusters of bubbles which fizz and pop as they slide back towards the devouring jaws of the next wave, ready to snap shut, swallow those bubbles, and spit out new ones. Or you may spend time studying the blue-white, galaxy-like speckled swirls on a mussel shell half dug like a spade into the sand. So a part of being specific, therefore, is to be meticulous with your details. Kooser says that the details are most alive when the reader is, quote, watching one particular old woman in a cardigan sweater burn wallpaper in a barrel, pushing it down and down with a crowbar. Think of how alive and specific this is. It is one old woman. She is wearing a cardigan. She has a crowbar. She is pushing wallpaper down repeatedly into a barrel. There's a lot of things that you can picture specifically about that scene. So how to be specific with your poems and your details? Kooser uses the example of a washing machine. If you use a noun like washing machine, so many associations might emerge. For example, you might think of the washing machine you saw in a dumpster that was no longer working, or you might see a washing machine in your grandmother's laundry room, which is pristine and perfectly working. If you use an adjective, for example, you say a broken washing machine, the number of associations has just narrowed, which is helpful for specificity. I'm so pleased I said that word. It's such a hard word for me to say. Another example, it's not so strong to say city when what you mean is London, or more specifically, an alleyway in a specific London suburb, peppered with details about a scraped up dumpster, a street lamp glowing as the alleyway spills into the street, and how it catches in the eye of a drunk university student stumbling out of the dark in a ripped white t-shirt. Now you're wondering why he's there, right? For another time. Another thing to be sure that you do is specify the number of things. If you say some dogs are crossing the street, there's no specific image. That could mean 15 dogs or 5. But if you say 3 dogs are crossing the street, you can picture 3 dogs crossing the street. So make sure that you use numbers too. Step 5, deepen your knowledge of the world. Kooser says that the more poems we read, the deeper is our knowledge of the world. Having a deeper knowledge of the world, the people, nature, names of things will only deepen your exploration in your poems. And one way to deepen your knowledge of the world is through attention. Kooser says that if you've noticed something in the world and it catches your attention, and then you also get an affective or emotional response to it, that's probably something you should write down. And then as you start exploring that through a poem, that emotion can be drawn out further. This happened to me once when I was walking back from the postbox past the plumeria plant in our garden. I've walked past this plant hundreds of times and I've looked at it, but this time I felt particularly drawn to it and quite emotional. I originally didn't really know why, so I was studying. I realized that it had one last white petal clinging to it. It made me think of a flag waving in surrender as the next season was coming. Of course, I took this advice and I wrote this down, and after a while I started to realize that petal was alone. It seemed lonely, and then I realized that I was experiencing a sense of loneliness, and it was only through fleshing out the details of this image that I was drawn to that I realized that. And then I set about to write a poem which explored themes of loneliness via this image as metaphor. So when you go about your day and you notice anything, perhaps it's something that you overheard in conversation, or it's something that you saw while you were driving through traffic or on a nature walk, make sure that you write these things down. If you feel pulled towards something, there's almost always a good reason for it, and perhaps the poem will tell you that reason. And how do you translate to the emotion that was drawn out? Well, that was not satisfying.
Did you get a paper cut?
No, never had a paper cut in my life. I know how to handle paper, unlike most. Step 6, engaging titles and opening lines. Remember, as we're talking about you wanting to invite the reader into your poem, your first chance to do that is with your title, and your second chance to do that are your opening lines. You want them, as Kooser says, to make a good impression. So if the title is the invitation and the first few lines are you inviting your guest in, the rest of the poem is the quality of the tea you're going to serve.
Very English of you.
Although a dramatic start can work, try not to trauma dump your reader with so much heaviness that when they see it, they're like, ugh, they want to pull out. Sometimes you can gently guide your reader into something that becomes more serious as the poem goes on. Another error you might make is bloating your poem with unnecessary details. Now I have a real-world example. When I was working in a 15th century village pub in the south of England, the graveyard shift was from about 3 p.m. till 5 p.m. And most days, the same gentleman would come in and it would sometimes just be me and him. So in this particular instance, he said something interesting, that an old lady in a blue Mini Cooper cut him off while he was on the motorway and stuck her middle finger up at him. And he said the funniest thing was she looked like Queen Victoria II, so a part of him felt like he had just been flipped off by royalty. Now that was interesting. So when you think about your poem, a bit like that story, start somewhere that's interesting, that draws and hooks your reader in. So you can use your titles in many different ways. Here are a few. One, you can give information as to where and when the poem is happening. Outside St. Mark's Church in winter. So you've instantly placed the reader in the scene and now you can colour it in with your poem. Or you can use a one-word title that references the subject of the poem. For example, peacock. And then you have a poem probably about a peacock. Or you can use the title of your poem as kind of a first line. My neighbour was knocking crazily at my door when... Then the poem can start. Remember, the reader wants essentials, they don't want all of the details. They just want the things that are the most exciting. As Kooser says, no spare parts. Step 7, use presence and action. Kooser calls what many typically call voice presence, and that all poems have a presence. It is up to you to control what this is. Kooser defines it as all the parts put together that a reader learns about the speaker's experience, each character's feelings, and all else from which is written. It is not just about what is said, but the style, how it is said. Every poem has presence, and you should pay attention when you're reading other people's poems, what aspects of presence are within it, what's being said, and what's being left out, and how is the poet saying it. Doing this will sharpen your own poetic skills when you come to see the presence that your own poems have. Furthermore, your poem should persuade in some way and bring about an action. This action doesn't need to be, it gets your reader to get up and go for a run. We're not dealing with, self-help necessarily. But the action can be what Owen Barfield calls felt change in consciousness, a emotional response, or a realization. These are actions you want to cause within your reader. Step 8, be strong in style and form. Your poem will inevitably turn into a shape. It will have to form into something. So one of the things you need to think about, for example, is line length. Do you want it long, flowing, prosaic, or do you want it short, choppy, staccato? As you write the poem and go to edit it, you'll start to gain an intuition as to what you might do best with the poem. Kooser says that enjoying a well-written poem is like going for a ride on a glass-bottomed boat. With a glass-bottomed boat, you want to be able to see through it down to the bottom. You want to see all the cool, colourful, tropical fish swimming around and maybe some dolphins and the coral and everything else. For the poem, you want the reader to be able to see through the poem to what is below. You don't want them to be hyper aware that they're looking at a page and reading ink. You want them to be taken into the dream of the poem to go into the more trance-like state. If you want to keep your reader in the trance-like state, you want everything to appear seamless. Kooser uses the example of glasses. If you are standing on the glass boat and someone drops their glasses into the water, it becomes murky and you become aware of where you are again. So in poetry, remember, every word is important. It is why Coleridge described it as the best words in the best order. If there's something that's juttering or jarring and is not intentional, the whole poem can stop being seamless. It's kind of like watching a film, but then it starts buffering. You become aware that you're watching a film rather than caught up in the film itself. You also need to pay attention to the sounds that you're using. Even if you want to use a synonym for something, let's say you want to use the word hand or you want to use the word palm. They sound different. They're made up of different consonants and different vowels. They don't necessarily refer to the same thing. I mean, the hand is the whole thing and the palm is specific. It's kind of like the heel of your hand. You have to think about how these fit within the rhythm and the meaning and the sound of the poem in order to insert them. If you do go to choose a different word, you might need to change a lot of other things in the poem because that might throw other aspects off. Step 9, do not be sentimental. I felt like my dad saying that. All the best poems contain emotion and feelings. And of course you want to put emotions into your poems, but they need to be a bit more subtle than that. So we have feelings, some of the intense, like anger or grief or guilt. We want to explore these in ways that feel revealing, that don't feel, like they're pressing down on top of someone. Again, you want to invite in. So you want to make sure your emotions aren't just a gush of sentiment, as Kooser says. You want them to be more controlled. You're not in a 90s coming-of-age teenage rom-com with a boombox standing outside your crush's window, crying and singing your favorite boy band love song. Or you are. Maybe use that as a title for a poem. Who knows? So when you write, try not to use so many emotional words in your language. That's going to just start becoming too much, and it might become comical to the reader. Like melodrama can be unintentionally comical. So I have an example. This one's about death. Rather than my loving grandma fell into the darkness of death while I was sitting with her and it made me feel absolutely devastated, you could say, grandma's leathery hands went limp in mine and a cold draft entered through the bedroom window's lip. This is more image-driven, more feeling-driven, and you can infer what's happening without saying that she died.
Show not tell, bro.
Show not tell. Sometimes tell, but opt to show more often, bro. It is up to the reader how they respond to your poem. You are not there to tell them how they are meant to feel, but you can control some of that response in the way that we were discussing earlier, the adjective use, to guide them through the poem so that the feelings that awaken in them, though you cannot control them, are more likely going to be in line with the effect you're having. If you're writing from memory, when you sit down to write as many details as you remember about that memory. Don't worry at the beginning about whether they are interesting or not. You can write for fluidity and then you get to edit for clarity. And when it comes to writing anecdotes, don't just write an anecdote and then just throw line breaks into it and say, this is a poem now. There are so many thousands of poems that Kooser admits to being fed up of reading That is nothing more than a story broken up into lines. Poetry needs more to elevate it out of that story. If the story has no aspiration to be something greater, it's not poetry, it's a story. Let's chew on that for a second. For that story to become poetry, it needs to be something greater. It can take, quote, art for composition in order to elevate it into poetry. You can use rhyme and assonance and rhythm and other aspects of poetry that make it poetry. In other words, you may be touching the essence of something with a story, but you want to go through that essence, again, into the heart. You want your reader to be, quote, swept up and away by your poem, not just merely amused by the anecdote. That's not to knock anecdotes. Anecdotes are things that we tell all the time and we relate to each other through them. In poetry that uses anecdote, make sure you don't just allow the story to lift it somewhere into poetry. Your poem's speaker needs their own, quote, characteristic voice. It needs to have unique syntax, rhythm, form, and composition. The story may be the material, but to make it poetry, you need to do something special to it. Another way to do this is through simile and metaphor. Step 11, make sure your similes and metaphors are strong. Your metaphors are not just pretty ornaments like you would put on a Christmas tree. They need to have substance and meaning for your poem. The simile or metaphor, Kooser says, should clarify the poem. When using similes, your poem usually will sound more relaxed. When you're using day-to-day speech, you're far more likely to say something is like something than something is something. So if the speaker in your poem, for example, is more casual and chatty, usually a simile is a better choice than a metaphor. However, a metaphor is more authoritative and declarative. A metaphor is like two objects adhesing, and the strength of the metaphor happens within the adhesion itself. A simile is more like having two things laying side by side. To ensure that you have a strong metaphor, then you need to make sure that the two objects are logically mirrored. The example that Kooser gives is cannonballs and grapes. You can say the grapes were like cannonballs. Perhaps they're bunched up and they're circular and they have a similar color. What isn't good to do is to speak about the dissimilarity now. So if you said that the cannonballs were heavy, the metaphor doesn't really work because grapes aren't heavy. And if you were to say that the grapes were sweet, the metaphor also doesn't really work because last time I tasted a cannonball, it wasn't particularly sweet. So the metaphor needs to show the similarities between the two objects that are adhesing. Kooser also says it's better to have no metaphors than a bad metaphor. There are plenty of great poems that do not have metaphors in them, so they are not absolutely essential, but they are something you should add to your poetry toolkit. Step 12, editing and improving your draft. When you've drafted a poem, let it cool off. It's not always easy to see where the weaknesses are. Kooser uses the example of a Petri dish. The longer that you leave it, the more stinky fungus comes up that you know that you do not want in your poem. Your first draft is going to have flaws. Over 99.9% of all first drafts by every poet, living or no longer living, had flaws in it and needed editing. It is important to edit. And you can take your time with your poem. Kooser reminds us, no one is waiting desperately for your next poem to get into their hands. You do not need to think, oh no, if I don't write, this other person won't even be able to breathe without my magnificent words. It is you who cares more about the success of your poem than anyone else. Sounds harsh, but it's true. And if in poetry you're seeking to discover a sense of truth, it's good to hear truth. Therefore, try not to rush your poems to get to as many people as possible. You don't need to write in a moment of intoxicated inspiration and straight away put it on TikTok or Instagram or whatever else. You can do that, but I suggest you sit and work on them. As Kooser says, it is better for everyone that you write one really good poem rather than publish 20 books of mediocre verse. There are a couple good ways that you can edit your poem beyond just reading it while it's there. One, you can read it aloud to yourself and see where you stumble, or you can give it to a friend and have them read it to you. But have them read it to you without them going over it first. See where they stumble, see what's awkward. Then after you read it, you can ask them questions. Kooser says not to ask value-laden questions. So rather than say, was it good? To which they can just say yes or no, you can say, was it clear? Was there anything you were confused by? Is there anything that didn't resonate with you? Then you can use these responses to potentially edit your poem. So the beauty is when we edit, we can go over our poems again and again and again, and we can get as close as what it is we need to say as possible. As promised, a bonus, step 13, write from your soul. In your poetry writing journey, Kooser says, no matter what, write from your soul. You want to ensure your poem is connecting with others and that they are seeing and understanding and connecting with the world in a new way. When you write from your soul and it comes across, you allow your readers to do that. You give them a new perspective. In short, when you start, you write from your heart, you write from your soul. Then you engage in what Kooser says, careful revision to get your poem to that stage where it can reach into your reader and touch their heart. That sounds weird. So that your poem can touch your reader's heart. The greatest pleasures of writing are in the process of writing itself. I know that there's publication and awards that we like to chase, and there's nothing wrong with wanting those things too. But at the end of it, the best part of it is the writing and then the sharing and the connecting with people through it. So remember, you're not just writing for yourself, you are also writing for a reader. You are writing from one heart, hoping to touch another heart. You are, like the metaphors, trying to bring hearts together. That might be a little sentimental, but I think for the end of this video, a bit of sentiment's okay. And remember to imagine your reader. Write for fluidity, edit for clarity. What do you think? What poems have you written or read that you feel most connected to? Please let me know in the comments below. And if you're new here, please do click subscribe and join my mailing list. It's in the description box below. If you're looking for some other ways to support this channel, we have just launched a donation feature on our website, which is linked below. Your donations help us make more high quality poetry videos. We really appreciate all your support and thank you for watching. See you next time.